Hello everyone, my name is Jack Grundy. I'm a visual effects and motion graphics artist based in England, and I'm here to do a tutorial with you today on creating helicopters from 2D images. So a little bit about me that you can find on my website here, which is jack-grundy.com. Find out a bit about myself. You can also find my other tutorials on my Vimeo channel, which is vimeo.com/jackgrundy, all one word. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating this effect with a helicopter flying over a city. So from this, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting an image of a helicopter. We're going to be creating our own rotors for the helicopter and animating them, and then we're going to be tracking the helicopter into the footage so that it matches the camera move that we can see here. So the image that I've used in order to create this, just for this tutorial's purpose, is one from Wikipedia on a G20 police helicopter. So the reason I've chosen this image is that it's really high resolution, which is great because you can see the helicopter doesn't take up that much room of the image. So the higher resolution, the better it is, the better quality that we're going to get. But also this is a free to use, commercially free image. So we're okay in this aspect to use it for this tutorial. So if I scroll down here, you can see the original author here, and you can view their work on Flickr. This is a link to that, and a bit of information about where this photo is from. So this is the image that we're going to use. You can download this directly from the Wikipedia link. I just went to Google, typed it in there, and it brought me straight to this under the Images tab. So I've already downloaded this for you. That'll be provided with the project files, and that's what we're going to be working with today in order to create this effect here. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into Photoshop. I'm going to use Photoshop to extract the image from the background, like so, like this. So there's a number of ways that you can do this. You can also do this in After Effects using the pen tool to cut around the actual shape of the helicopter. But this just demonstrates the actual amount of the image that we're going to be using. So we're not including the blades at the back, and we're not including the main helicopter blades as well, because as I said, we're going to create these ourselves in After Effects. So the way that I extracted this helicopter from this image is that I actually just used the quick selection tool in Photoshop. I could be more precise with the pen tool, but for the purposes of this, we don't need to be that exact. When you're doing your own projects, I would recommend that you do that, but for this, we only need to use the quick selection tool. So I'm going to select that here, and then I'm going to left click and start drawing brush strokes of the areas that I want to keep. So all these bits here, like so, and don't worry about selecting these areas as well. We can remove them in a second. So to zoom in, to start doing a little bit finessing with the work, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and then I'm going to zoom in onto my image, and that way I can actually start selecting other bits that I need to keep, as well as removing bits that I don't want to include in my selection. So at the minute, if I make my brush bigger, you can see there's a little plus sign in the middle of my brush. This means it's an additive selection. So it means that we're adding to selection that we are choosing. So if I click here, that will add that selection there. Just undo that with Control Z. I'm working on a Mac, so it's Command, but on Windows it's always Control. In order to make this a negative selection so that we can deselect these areas here, we want to hold down the Alt key, and that you can see that it turns it to a minus symbol. So then we can start removing areas like this. You notice that my brush is a little too big for these areas here, and to change this you can simply go up to this area here at the top and choose and turn the size down of your brush. But I prefer to use the keyboard shortcuts, which are the square brackets, which are next to the P key on your keyboard. So the left square bracket will make it smaller, and the right square bracket will make it bigger. So I tend to use these as often as I can. So I'm just going to refine these areas now, and then start deselecting these parts as well. if it starts deselecting areas like this, don't worry too much. As I say, just let go of the Alt key and you can start selecting them again. Or you can use a combination of things like the pen tool, the eraser tool and things like that in order to make your selections better. So I'm just going to zoom in, remove these areas here, decrease the size of my brush and just carry on. So I'm not going to take it to absolute precision for this because it's just for demonstration purposes, but I'm going to try and make it look as clean as I can and add these back in here. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the selection that I've got now. As we can see there, I have left a little bit there which I would generally go in and fix, but for this we're doing okay. And I'm just going to get rid of that little bit there as well. And what I'm going to do now is simply cut this from the background, and to do this I'm going to separate onto a different layer. So I'm going to do Command or Control and C to copy, Command and Control V to paste. Now if I turn this little eyeball off on the background layer, you can see that I've selected that image now and I've put it on its own layer. So again, I can go in and refine this further if I wish. I'm holding down the spacebar to bring up the pan tool. That allows me to move around the image when zoomed in like this. And I'm just going to use the eraser tool here. And the brush size you can change the same way as we did with the quick selection tool, just using the square brackets, and erase these extra bits like so. I'm just going to do this very quickly. Move across, and we end up with something roughly like this. So let's zoom back out. You can see I missed a bit there, but that's not a problem. What I'm going to do from here is I'm actually going to blur the edges of my selection just to kind of soften it a little bit, because the quick selection leaves it a little bit jaggedy around the edges. You get like these little like steps on the selection, so I'm going to blur these by selecting the blur tool. You can make that as big or small as you want, but I'm just going to go around the edge just to soften that out a bit, and especially down these areas here. Okay, I'm not being too precise, but again, be as precise as you need to be. You want to make this effect look as good as you possibly can. I have actually used this effect for several different projects, some my own, some for actual client projects as well. I'll show you my most recent one at the end of the tutorial, where you can actually see the effect that we are creating here in action. So now that I've made my selection like that, I've blurred the edges, what I'm going to do is save this image out now. So to do this, first of all I'm going to crop it, so use the crop tool on the left. I'm going to define a region around it and then simply scale it to the right size, like so, and then just double click. Now I've got a nice little image that I can use here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this out as a PNG file from Photoshop. So go File, Save As, and from the drop down under Format, you're going to navigate to where you want to save it to, and then choose PNG. Some people prefer to work in the Photoshop format, which will keep the layer structure that we have here. But because we're only working with one individual layer of this helicopter, we're happy to use PNGs for this. The reason that we use PNGs is that it will actually keep the alpha channel of the image. The alpha channel being where we have transparency. So where we've erased the sky in the background, that is now transparent and see-through, which allows us to overlay this image onto other footage, which we want to keep. So as I said, we're going to File, Save As, navigate to where you want to save it, go PNG, and then hit Save. Say that you want to replace it, because I've already got one there, so I'll just name this 2, just so we can go to the next screen. I can show you what happens then. So now it's going to ask us whether we want to save it as none or interlaced. Interlaced and none, this is actually progressive, and it's to do with the video file of what you're actually going to be placing this footage in. Video was always filmed at like 1080i, for example, which is interlaced, but with what we're using here, it's progressive footage. And if you want to learn more about these, if you Google fields versus frames or interlace versus progressive into Google, you can find out more information about this. And it's just basically to do with how the image is split in order to save on data and things like that, also with broadcast. It's worth looking into for future reference and when you get footage, but for this we are actually just going to stick with none, being progressive, because that's what our background footage is that we're going to be using. And then just simply click OK. I'm not going to do this because I've already saved an image out, so I'm just going to use that when we go into After Effects now. So now we're in After Effects, and what I want to do is I want to import my footage into my project panel here. So File, Import File. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my background footage, which is this here, building BG footage. And I'm also going to bring in that PNG that I created, which is here. Selecting both by holding down the Control or Command key. And then just click Open. Now, first of all, we're going to create our composition. And you can do this one of three ways. The first way that we can do this is we can simply take our background footage here and drag it down into the timeline, and that will create a composition for us. The other way we can do this is set up a custom composition by going Composition, New Composition, and that way we can define the size of our composition and what the footage is going to be placed into. The reason we might want to do this is we might have the project being much larger overall, but we have other smaller elements that are going to be added in, and we don't want the project to be the size of those elements. For example, our PNG image here is, as it says, 3,800 by 2,500. So we don't need a project that big because our background footage isn't that size. We can also finally click on this little film icon here, which allows us to create, again, a custom composition. Or we can simply drag and drop our background footage onto this icon as well. You might use this approach where you drag and drop on when you've already got one timeline created or one composition. You can only drag and drop your footage into the timeline straight away if you've got no other compositions, because if you do it later on, all you're doing is adding to a composition rather than creating a new one. So now we've got our composition created, and we're just going to play through the footage here, and we can have a look at how it looks. Okay, there we go. So that's our footage that we're going to be using. So we've got the camera shaking about, we've got the building in the background, we've got this fence in the foreground as well. So what we're going to do first is we're going to start actually setting up our helicopter before we start getting into the more advanced things of tracking and compositing. So I'm going to drag and drop my helicopter into my timeline down here, and first of all it's the wrong way round. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the transform properties down here, and I'm going to change the scale to a negative value. But if I do this, all it's going to do, if I type negative 100, is it's going to completely flip the entire image upside down. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to click on this little constrain proportions button to get rid of that little chain link, and then I'm going to change the X value, which is the horizontal value, to negative 100. And what this does is it just flips the image so that it's facing the other way. Now obviously there's a problem with this, that the text on the side is now back to front, but for the purposes of this, that we're okay. You can go in and you could paint this out and you could flip it back or anything like that if you wanted to, or add your own text on, that's fine. But the purpose of this tutorial is just to show you how to create the animated helicopter itself, so I'm not too worried about that for now. The next step I'm going to do is constrain these proportions again, so that when it comes to doing things like scaling, it will still stay all in the correct aspect ratio, so it's not going to squash and compress or stretch out. So, and it just helps me keep things nice and tidy. Just going to close this. Okay, So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start creating my rotor blades. And I'm going to do this using solids. So I'm going to go Layer, New, Solid. And I'm going to use the little eyedropper tool to sample a colour from the helicopter so that it matches closely. So something like this. And once I've selected this colour, I'm just simply going to click OK, and the new solid has been created for me. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rounded rectangle tool, which is up here. When you start off, you'll have what's just the rectangle tool that's right next to the pen tool. And if you left click and hold, you can change this custom shape, or this preset shape, into a different one that you can see in front of you. So I'm going to choose the rounded rectangle tool, and then in my composition window I'm going to left click and drag out and create my first rotor. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to change to my selection tool, and you can do that up here by selecting this tool here, or you can press V on the keyboard. If you hover over any of these buttons, it will actually tell you what the keyboard shortcut is. And what I'm going to do with the selection tool now is I'm going to draw a marquee around these bottom 3 points here. You get the marquee tool automatically when you've got a mask active or selected, and it's this white arrow with a little box next to it. It allows you to select multiple points at once and just isolate them. I'm then going to zoom in by using my mouse wheel across. By holding down the spacebar, it's the same as in Photoshop. By holding down the spacebar, you can pan. And I've got these 4 points selected, and then I'm simply going to double click on one of them, and it brings up this little transform box here. What I can do from here now is scale this box in and create that tapered shape which I want for the helicopter blades. Once you've done that, just simply hit return or enter on the keyboard, and that will make that selection like so. So if I hide my mask now using this, you can see that I've got the approximate shape of my rotor. Now, to make life easier, rather than having to draw 3 of these, I'm simply going to just duplicate up this layer and rotate it around to create my 3 helicopter blades. So the first thing I'm going to do is, again, to make this easier, is I'm going to move my anchor point. My anchor point being this little red dot here, and that's the center of all animation. So I'm going to bring up my rotation property under transform, and if I just rotate this, you can see how that works. So up on the top toolbar, I'm going to take what's called the pan behind tool, or you can press Y on the keyboard, select this point and move this point down to the center at the bottom of my rotor blade. This tool will only allow you to actually select the anchor point. It won't allow you to click and move a layer or anything like that. It literally just moves the anchor point only. Go back to my selection tool, and now I can rotate like so. So you get the idea of where I'm going with this. So now I'm going to select my layer and do Command D, Control D on Windows, and I've duplicated my layer. Again, I'm going to bring up the rotation property of this layer, but instead of going through the little arrow drop downs, I'm going to press R for rotation, R on the keyboard, and that'll just isolate that parameter here that I can control. I'm going to rotate that out like so. Let's make this fit the screen. And then what I'm going to do is select this layer and again duplicate it. Bring up the rotation property and rotate that out like so. And very quickly I've got my 3 rotor blades here. Now the next step I'm going to take is I'm going to pre-compose these 3 blades together so that I can animate them all at the same time easily. You could go the option of parenting 2 of them to another. So if I parent these 2 bottom ones to the top one, that way when I rotate it works great. And that is an option you can do. We are going to put these into 3D space to match the angle of the helicopter as well. I just find that I lose a little bit of control over it all if I do it this way. I prefer to do the pre-compose way, but that's a personal preference. You can work it either way that you like. But as I say, I find I get more control over that. So I'm going to select these 3 layers. So select one, hold shift, and then select the top one. That'll select all 3. And then we're going to go layer, pre-compose. I'm going to name this rotor blades. And then it's going to be move all attributes in new composition. That's what we want. And just click OK. Now you see we've got a new composition with these 3 blades in. The only problem we've got now is that we need to move the anchor point again to the center here. So I'm going to press Y on the keyboard to bring up the pan behind tool. Place this as central as I can. Hold down space to pan across. Zoom in again. Get it as close to the center as I can, but I don't need to be perfect with this. Like so. And now I can simply just, again, hit the R key and rotate like this. If you find that one of these blades is being cut off in this composition, that's because when you set these up, one of these blades was overhanging the composition viewer here. So what you might want to do in that case is double click on the composition, select all the layers, and with select tool just move them up, for example. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to position these where I think that they will be, like so. But the problem here is that we've got the angle of the helicopter that we need to match. So we're going to place them into 3D space. And when we do that, it brings up other options under the rotation properties here. So we've got orientation, and then it splits the rotation into individual axis of the X, the Y, and the Z axis. This allows us to rotate them in different ways. So I'm going to play with the orientation of this because that's the way I want to work with it. And we've got the X axis here, so that will tilt it forwards and backwards. We've got the Y axis, which will tilt it left and right, or spin it rather. And we've got the Z axis, which is the same as what we saw before with the rotation. So I'm going to tilt it with the X, like so, to try and, I'll say, guesstimate the angle. And then same with the X, I'm going to try and do the same. I'm also going to move this up a little bit. I'm going to do this by clicking on what these little gizmo handles. This is referred to as a gizmo. Comes from 3D modeling in 3D space. When you want to move this in the positional sense, it's easier if you hover over one of these little gizmos like so, where you can actually see the letter. Otherwise you are freely, if I click here and move it like this, I am freely moving the object in 3D space, which can cause problems depending on the project that you're doing. In this instance, I want to just move it up a little bit, so I'm going to hover over the Z axis, click, and that will only move it up and down, like so. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this layer below my helicopter layer. The reason being is that if there is any overlap, like if you make these blades any bigger and it goes behind these areas here, if you don't place them below the helicopter layer, it will look as if it's chopping through it, which isn't what we want. So I always just place it underneath just for safety. If you want to actually view the position of where you've placed it without this gizmo in the way, you can see it's quite high off there actually. You can simply do Command Shift and H, or Control Shift and H. What that does is it's a shortcut function to hide all the little handles that you get on your layers, so the scale properties or transform properties that you would get around the borders, the anchor point, and any of these little gizmos as well. So you can just change that like so. I'm going to keep them on for a second. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to reposition my helicopter blade. So, and now you can see here where that blade has gone behind the helicopter, which, because of the angle of this, that would be correct. So I'm going to actually angle this a bit more. So I'm just going to Command Shift H, that'll hide, like so, which is looking good. So the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to parent my rotor blades to the helicopter. And what this will allow me to do is later on, depending on the way that you work, that when we animate the helicopter, it will actually move with the helicopter. We aren't going to do it in this instance, we're going to pre-compose again later on. But when you're doing different types of projects, depending on what it is, sometimes that's the best way to do it. So it's a good workflow to get into, regardless of whether you're using it in this case or not. Now to create the back rotor, this is a very simple process. I'm simply going to select the rotor blades here, Command D and duplicate. I'm going to bring up my gizmos, bring up the rotation again, right click on the orientation and choose reset, and that will just set it back to the default position that it was in. So move it across on the X and the Y. Put it here, hide these again, and you can see that that's behind that actual piece of the tail. And then from here I'm simply just going to scale it down. So select layer, hit S on the keyboard to scale, and I'm going to scale it down to about there. And then we've got some blades for that as well. You can do this in a different order, and you'll see what I mean in a second. But you don't have to. And what I mean by doing it in a different order is, I don't know. So I'm going to cut that bit. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to animate these blades. So we're going to animate them using the Z rotation here. So on my keyframes here, let me just bring up the rotation for that, for the little back blades. I'm going to click on the stopwatch of the Z rotation of my main blades. Bring up these again so you can see which one I'm talking about, these. And on my first frame, I'm going to click on the stopwatch to create my first keyframe. So now I'm going to add a keyframe on my end frame as well. And to do this, I'm going to choose and click here and set this multiplier to 8. Now what this does is, in After Effects, when you want to make something rotate, you click and drag here on the Z rotation, and it makes it spin. When After Effects reaches to 360 degrees, what it does is, rather than carrying on that number to 361, 362, 720, anything like that, is it uses this little option here as a multiplier to tell you how many times it's done one full revolution, being the 360 degrees. So what I've typed in here is that I want from this keyframe, which is 0, between that time I want it to do 8 revolutions. So 8 times 360 degrees, that's what that means. So if I hit the RAM preview button here, if you've got a full keyboard, just hit the 0 on the number pad and it does the same. I'm working on a laptop, so I'm just going to use the preview bar here. And you can see exactly what I mean there, where it's rotating. So it's doing 8 revolutions during this time. Depending on the length of your project, will depend on how high this number goes. If it's a lot longer, you want it to do more revolutions, otherwise it will be moving too slow. One thing that I do recommend is that you don't go too high with this number, because as stupid as it sounds, it makes it look like it's actually moving slower. And the reason for that is the blades are moving so fast that we're not actually, your eyes can't physically see every bit of the blade turning, so it actually looks like it's moving slower. So by reducing this number to something like 8 in this instance, you'll find that it'll actually move at a better speed. And then we just simply do the same thing again for the back rotors. Now, if you don't want to look too samey, because these are duplicated, I tend to set the start keyframe of this to be something like 180 degrees. So it starts at a different position. Then I'll create my keyframe, and then move to my last frame and set the multiplier again to 8, maybe 6 actually, because it's actually smaller. So because it's smaller, it'll be looking like it's moving faster, And so it just gives it a little bit of variety in terms of the look of this, like so. But there's still something off with this, and what I mean by that is these blades are too sharp all the way through. You know, as we drag through, we can see them very cleanly and very clearly on every single frame, and that's not what a helicopter will look like. If you ever look at footage on like YouTube or anything like that, you'll see that there is actually motion blur, or even in real life you'll see that there's motion blur as these spin. So that's exactly what we're going to add to this now. So to switch that on, where we did the 3D switches before, there's this little kind of ball with like this little ghost effect, and we want to check the boxes for that. But we also need to turn it on for the composition here. So the reason that we've got these two different ways of switching it on and off is that motion blur takes up a lot of rendering and processing power, particularly when you're doing your final render. It will take longer if it's got motion blur, but it'll look more realistic. If you've got lots of layers with motion blur added onto them and you want to speed up your workflow while you're working, like in this instance, rather than having to switch this off for every single layer, you've got this master switch here that will just turn it on for every layer for you. And once you turn it on, you can see that you get a much better result. It looks more realistic and better. So we're getting a lot closer to our final result of what we're actually going for here. And what I'm simply going to do now is I'm going to pre-compose these three layers, so the two rotor blades and the helicopter together, for the same reasons as I did with the rotor blades themselves, is that I can control all three layers through one parameter. You know, all my animation now is set up that what I'm only going to be doing with this helicopter now is putting it into position, animating its movement, scaling it down and compositing it into the scene. So rather than having to do that to three separate layers, I might as well, you know, compress them down or flatten them down into a single layer and then just animate and manipulate that single layer. You can see all my animation's still there, but it just makes it a lot easier for me to control now. So from here I'm going to start compositing my helicopter into my scene, and I don't actually have to do that much in this instance for this footage. What I've just got to do is try and match the colour tones of the helicopter, the background to the helicopter, and I'm going to do that with the effect called tint under colour correction, and I click and drag that onto my helicopter layer. And what this allows me to do is map the highlights and the shadows of my background image to my foreground, my helicopter. So what we're looking for is the darkest point on this background footage and the lightest point, as in closest to white. And what that does is it's mapping the highlights and shadows to the helicopter so that it matches. So the darkest point on the helicopter will be roughly equal to the darkest point on the background, same as the highlights as well. So I'm going to try and find a point on this background which might be quite good for this. I have obviously done this run through before, so I'm going to go for an area down here in these little windows for the map black to, like that. And for the map white to, I'm going to use one of these windows here, like so. Now it doesn't look like much now, but once we start getting it into its position and once it starts animating, we are very, very close to a final product with this. In the tint option as well, you've got the amount to tint at the minute. The whole image been completely washed over with these two colours and blended together, but we can control the amount that it does that from 0 to 100%. So we can scale this back depending on what you need to. It really is personal preference. There's no technical or exact amount which will work, and every single time you do this effect will be different depending on the project that you're working on as well. So my next thing will be to actually start positioning my helicopter in place, and I'm simply going to click and move it up here. I'm going to bring up the scale parameter and scale it down. Again, you've just got to, judge it for yourself in terms of the size of what the helicopter will be. The further away it's going to be, obviously the smaller it's going to be. But you've got to think about the context of what this is going to be in. This is supposed to be flying above or behind this building here. So you don't want it too big. Again, you don't want it too small because it might be, for example, interacting with something that's here. Or anything like that, it might be close, it might be flying in front of it. It just depends. So, try and be realistic with your size selection. What's good is that you have got these windows that you can kind of compare them to. If you think of someone like a 6-foot tall man or woman stood here, you could use that as kind of a reference on the size that you think it would be. So, that might be a little too small, but I'm actually making it look as if it's slightly further away. So, as I say, there's things there that will help you within this footage to make that decision, but it is personal preference on what you're going for. And if I turn this tint back up now, you'll actually see that it starts to look like it's kind of being affected by the ambient light of this scene, particularly in the sky as well, that it starts to blend in a lot better. It's still too sharp because it's coming from a high resolution image. If we zoom in, for example, and if I actually just bring this down for a second, just for this, you can see that as we zoom in here on this background footage, it was shot on a 5D Mark II. You can see that there's kind of like this little blurriness between the pixels, even in the background, which is supposed to be in focus. It's not very sharp, whereas this image is very sharp. So what we want to do is actually soften this out, and very straightforward, we're just going to add a fast blur effect to do this. I'm going to double click on that with my layer selected, and that will automatically apply it as an effect. But it's not done anything yet because we need to increase this value. So again, personal preference on this. And what I'm trying to do is try and match the fuzziness, if you will, of the background footage when we zoom in at this kind of scale. And to me, that's looking like it's getting pretty close. Often you will use fast blur because it's in name, it renders really fast. It's easy to use. There are other blurring options that you have got, but in most cases you might get away with using fast blur. I use it quite a lot for when I'm trying to do false depth of field. So it's really useful for something like that. What we're also going to do is we're going to check this box of repeat edge pixels. That's for when you have something that completely fills the screen and you start blurring it out. What it does is it starts pulling it away from the edges, so you get little bits of transparency or a gradient, like fall off to transparency around the edges. And by repeating edge pixels, it just brings them back. So for this, you don't really need to do it because look how far away it is from the actual edges of that shape. But it's always just, again, good practice to get into, and I always add it on. So now we've got that, what I'm going to do is place my helicopter in its final position, so where it's going to move to at the end, like so. And then I'm going to start setting it up under the rotation and position. Now the way I brought these two things up at the same time is that if you press, for example, R on the keyboard for the rotation, and you hold down Shift and then press the next keyboard shortcut, which for this is P for position, that will bring that up as well and just keep them two isolated rather than going through the transform options as you usually would. Same as if you wanted to bring up scale, Shift and press S. And if you want to hide just one of them, you press Shift and you press that again, that letter again on the keyboard. So it's in the final position. I'm going to rotate it to angle it a little bit better so it looks like it's moving forward. And then what I'm going to do is add a keyframe on the position on my end frame of my timeline. And then I'm going to move back in time and then just drag it across and then drag it up. Now I know obviously that it started here and now at the end where we were, and now it's over here, but don't try and compensate for that just yet. Remember that we're going to track this in to the footage, so it is going to stick in one position in relative to the camera. It's going to look like it was actually there filmed. So you don't need to move it that much at this point. Don't try and move it off here, because it will just do a crazy move across the screen. So just a little bit like that should be fine. And of course you can always go back and adjust this when you've actually done your track as well, which is what we're going to do now. So the first thing we're going to do is bring in a new layer, which is a null object. I'm going to select this in my timeline, press enter on the keyboard and rename this to Heli Tracker. Again, this is good practice to get into, naming your layers such as this, because when you do things with multiple trackers, it will automatically start off like null 1. You bring another one, null 2, null 3, null 4 and so on. And when you're trying to apply it to different things, it can get a little bit crazy and confusing. For this we only need one, but as I say, in other ones you might have different trackers for different things, you might have different things going on, and you might have multiple helicopters as well. I did a project where I had a helicopter in the foreground, a helicopter in the, well, mid-ground if you will, and the helicopter in the far background. And because there was buildings that were dotted about and that, I had enough information to track from, but you can't just link them to one tracker. The reason being is that you've got to deal with what's called parallax. And parallax is the distance between two objects and the movement of them as you pass them by. So if you imagine that yourself sat in a train and looking out the window, you'll see like all the trees flying past you really quickly because they're very close, whereas things like buildings or, you know, land masses far away will move very, very slowly. And that's because of the parallax, this relationship of distance between you and the object. The further away it is, it seems like it moves slower. So when we look at things like this building versus this fence, for example, as the camera shakes and moves, this fence looks like it moves a lot more than this building will. So when we go to track this helicopter into our footage, we don't want to use any of these points on the fence because they're not useful to us. The helicopter is not going to be here, like as in close up to the camera. It's going to be far away over there, more likely where the building is. So you've got to be aware of these things, that you can't just always do one tracker. It depends on how far away the subject is from your footage because of the movement of the camera. If it's on a tripod, it's fine, but if it is moving, you've got to be aware of this fact. So I'm going to go to my end frame because that's where I set up my helicopter to be. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on my background footage and choose track motion. Now for this I'm only doing a 1-point track just to get the position, so, because the camera isn't rotating, like as in, you know, rolling left to right, and it's not zooming in or out as well, so we don't need to worry about scale. If you do need any of these, all it does is bring up another track point like so, and what it's doing is it's calculating the relationship between these 2 points. So if it's rotation, it's calculating the rotation like this, you know, as it rotates around between the 2 points. And if it's scale, it's calculating the distance between the 2 points. So as they, you know, if something's getting further away, they'll get closer together. As it gets closer, these points will get more distance between them. So that's how they work, like that. I'm just going to delete that track point too, I don't need it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and select a point on this building that I can track. Now the best place I can do this is these roof little assets that we've got here. Assets, that's from CG. These little like antenna things, like so. I'm going to choose one of these. I'm going to choose this one here. For no other reason that it's better than any of these, it's mainly because there's a distinct point where there is contrast. Because the After Effects tracker, what it does is it imagines that this image is a black and white image, kind of like this. And what it's looking for is the contrast between the foreground object and the background object, so it's got something to track. It really, really likes tracking things like corners, such as a window or anything like that, where there is a distinct shape so you've got that 90-degree angle shape, but it also likes a high contrast between, say, like black and white. So if you've got a black window with a white frame with a corner, then it absolutely loves it because it's got distinct pixels that it can lock onto because it's a pixel-based tracker. There are other software packages that you can get, one of which is included with After Effects CS5 or CS4 and above, which is Mocha, which is a planar tracker, which I'm not going to go into now, but there are big differences between these two trackers and the way that they work, but they do integrate really well, so it's worth checking that out if you haven't. Mocha is really good for things like monitor replacement, billboard replacement. I've even used it to replace vinyls on the side of a van. So if you are interested in tracking, which I highly recommend that you at least spend some time doing if you want to be a compositor or visual effects artist, it's definitely a program that you need to start learning because it is used in high-end visual effects as well as independent filmmaking as well. So with the tracking points here, what we've got is at the center we've got the anchor point. That's where the animation data is going to be stored. We've then got this inner bounding box, which is our feature window. And what we do with this is we scale it and size it to the size of the object we are tracking. So in this case, we're making it the size of this top of this antenna. And as I said, the reason I've chosen this over the other ones is that we've got this like black line here and these two as well, but we've also got these gaps in between that have contrast that we can use, whereas these are just solid shapes which only have like essentially 1 point of contrast here. It still probably would work, but I've just found in my own personal experience that this point has worked best for me. This outside box is your search area box, which is where After Effects is looking for these pixels, this selection here, in the next frame only. So depending on the speed of your camera move, depends on how big you want to make this box. So if the camera moves really fast and these pixels move from here to here, then this bounding box is a good size for that. But if these pixels move from here to here in the next frame, your tracker isn't going to work. You need to make your search box bigger. So I know that the footage doesn't move that extremely, so it doesn't have to be too big, because the bigger it is, the longer it'll take to process and the longer you're going to be tracking. So in order to speed it up, only make it as big as your biggest movement between two frames. So it might not be these two frames here, it might be somewhere in the middle, but only make the bounding box as big as that. You can of course stop the tracker as it's tracking, increase the size, then decrease the size just for them specific frames. But if you're just starting out tracking, then it's good to just kind of set it to one specific size so you don't have to think about that. So now we're going to get into actually tracking. First of all, before I do anything, I'm going to set my target, and I do this by doing edit target, and here it's automatically selected that null object for me. The reason being is that the null object was already in my timeline or in my composition before I chose to track. If it wasn't, if I decide to track the footage and then bring in a null object later, you will have to go through this edit target option. So that's why I wanted to bring this to your attention. And then you just simply choose the layer you want to apply it to. Heli tracker is the one we want, so that's fine. Now because I'm at the end frame here, I'm going to want to track backwards, which is under this analyze option here. So we've got analyze one frame backwards at a time. We've got analyze backwards, which will do all of the timeline in one go. We've got the analyze forward, which if you're starting at a frame somewhere at the start or in the middle, again that will analyze forward all in one go, and analyze forward one frame at a time. When you are tracking, you don't always have to start at the beginning or the end. Sometimes the best place might be somewhere in the middle, then you track backwards, then you go back to that point in the middle and track forwards. The reason being is that you might have fast moving footage where there's a lot of motion blur now and again, and you might want to start on a frame where there's no motion blur or as little as you can get so that you can get the best track possible. So we're going to be tracking backwards for this, and what else you're going to do is, because there is motion blur on this, sometimes when I track backwards, what will happen is when the camera starts moving, you see I lose my track. So to kind of get around this, I can do a couple of things where I can track one frame at a time backwards, like so, and if I need to, I can simply just move that point back over, like so. The reason my image is still black and white is that I've just gone into the red channel here. I'm just going to set that back to colour so we can see. So move it back into place, next frame again, move it back, and so on and so on. And so you want to do a combination of these things. You might find that you set it to the right size, as I said before at the start. And see right there where I've increased the size of my search bar, it's actually, I'm doing an automatic track, it's actually held it pretty well itself. You also notice that I was stopping and starting my track. The reason that I stop and start it is that if I decide I want to undo a section of the track, when I do an automatic track all in one go, if I do Command Z to undo, it will undo a larger chunk of my keyframes. So if I did it all in one go, it would undo everything. Whereas if I stop and start it, it'll only undo up until the point that I last stopped. So it'll only undo, like say, these 8 keyframes rather than all of them. So now that I've tracked that, I'm happy with that. I'm going to click apply, and I'm going to apply it on the X and Y. The reason being is the camera is moving left and right, being the X axis, but it's also moving up and down slightly, which is the Y. So by doing that, you're just accommodating for both axes. Click OK, and what it does is it'll apply it, that tracking data, to the position of the null object. Now the reason that we've applied it to a null object rather than the helicopter directly is that we wanted to animate the helicopter's position, and if we applied this tracking data to the position of the helicopter, we can't animate it as easily as opposed to applying it to a null object and then parenting it to that null object, because you only get one keyframe on this position. So if we were to do that, for example, if we were doing that with this null object, and I said, right, okay, I'm going to say the null object was my helicopter, so right, okay, I'm going to move it so it's in the right position there. I'm going to go to my end keyframe, and I want to move it over there. Go to my, and as soon as I go to my next keyframe, it'll jump straight back to where it was. So we can't animate the helicopter moving across the screen doing that. What's also great is, as I said before, if you've got multiple helicopters in the scene, so if we had one here, one here, one here, for example, we can parent all of these helicopters to this tracker, and we've only got to track it once then. We're not going to keep applying it to different ones, and we can just link them all together. So what I've done is I've moved to my final frame now, where I lined up my helicopter to my background. I'm going to take the pick whip and just parent that to my helicopter tracker, and then when I hit RAM preview, what it should do is it will move as the camera is moving while still animating across the screen. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do now for this, or one last thing before we do any checks, is that if I hide these again, Command Shift and H, we've got the same problem as we had before with the helicopter blades. As the camera is moving, you can see the background has all this motion blur, but the helicopter is completely sharp and we can see it very clearly. That's not really useful for us because it doesn't look real. Nothing is that sharp. You can't have, you know, one object completely sharp and while the other one is completely defocused because of camera move. The reason that you get the motion blur is because of the shutter speed and how fast it opens and closes. So this would be PAL footage at 25 frames a second, so the shutter will open at 50 times a second because it's 1/50th. If you want to find out more about that, it's to do with filmmaking. I suggest you go, again, have a look online and find out more about that. But you can't have something that is filmed, which is what we're trying to make this look like it was all in one go, with two separate shutter speeds where this is completely sharp while everything else is blurry because of motion. So same as we did before, we're just going to turn on the motion blur switch for the helicopter, and that will just fix that problem for us. But it just looks a lot better and a lot more pleasing to the eye, because things, when they're very, very sharp, as it was before, can be a little bit jarring to the eyes and make you feel a little bit kind of queasy. It's like the opening to Saving Private Ryan, where it's very, very sharp and it has that, no motion blur effect. Sometimes it's a stylistic choice, but for this it doesn't work. So now we've got that in place, we can, go back and tweak any of these tint properties. We can add, more blur, less blur, depending on what we want. It really just is, user preference in terms of what you're going to go for. One thing that I would add into this now is noise. So I'm going to use the effect noise, double click and add that to the helicopter. And the reason that I add noise is what you're actually getting on the footage of the background is this little digital grain, like you can see here, that animates as the footage plays. Now I know this, obviously we're adding a noise filter rather than a grain filter, but the reason I do this is because it renders faster and it plays back faster. And we're just going to add a little bit of noise to this image. If I increase that really high, you can see a difference. I turn that on and off, there's a distinct difference. That is very high, but what we're trying to do is match the noise pattern, if you will, or the noise size of our background. So it's very, very subtle. If we go to a frame where there's less motion blur, might help. You can see there that there's that's a lot of noise. So we just take that down to something like 6, 7, something like that, and it just adds that subtlety. And when you do other types of compositing with still images particularly, you need to add that kind of noise back in so that it looks like it matches more with the footage as well. You don't have to do it so much with video footage that you've shot, but you certainly have to do it with computer generated image, because there is no noise on a digital camera in a 3D computer package. So adding noise and things like that, again, a workflow thing that you should get used to doing, and you're just trying to match the size of the noise and it'll automatically animate for you. So once we've done that, we are pretty much done with our effect. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, hope you learned something from it, and we'll find things that you could do with this, whether it is actually doing helicopters in your own projects, in your own sequences for your showreel, anything like that, but also that you can figure out ways to apply the techniques that we've covered here into different projects as well, using things like the 3D space, using animation, tracking techniques and things like that. So I hope it has been useful for you, and as I said before, I will show you the link to the music video where I've used this, which is a band called Darktown Jubilee. The song is called Breakdown, and if I scrub through this, you can see some of the different effects that were created for this. So there you can see there's a copy of the helicopter right there, which was added in. I did quite a lot of the effects in this music video myself. I didn't do any of the smoke effects, but I did do the helicopter effects. But if you want to check that video out, then by all means do, and I hope you enjoy the work there. There's some great effects in there. It's got some a big name British actor in there, Steve Evans as well, and the band is a great band as well, so I hope you enjoy the song there as well. So thank you very much for your time, hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and see you next time.